Welcome back to Philosophy 101. This is Unit 1, Lecture 2, an absurdly brief overview of Western intellectual history. In this video, I'll introduce you to some of the major periods of intellectual history as it applies to our introduction to the Western philosophical tradition. The story of Western philosophy begins in what anthropologists call the Iron Age, but it might be helpful to put that into larger context. Anthropologists organize the story of humanity into periods characterized by the material remains of our ancestral culture, particularly the materials from which they made their tools. There are four main periods of tool development. The earliest is, of course, the Stone Age, which covers tool usage from proto-humans all the way up to anatomically modern Homo sapiens sapiens. This period encompasses millions of years of human evolution and cultural development. In the 5th to 4th millennium BCE, there was widespread use of copper for making axes, which gives us the brief Chalcolithic, or Copper Age. You may be familiar with Ötzi, the Iceman, who was famously recovered in the Italian Alps with an excellent specimen of a copper hand axe represented by this reproduction. The Copper Age quickly gave rise to the smelting of copper with tin to make bronze, a much more durable material for making tools. The Bronze Age would see the rise of a massive trade network in copper and tin, as well as finished bronze implements that would form the backbone of one of the first truly international economic systems. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age trading network suddenly collapsed, bringing down most of the European and Near Eastern kingdoms associated with the bronze trade. The ensuing Dark Age, which followed, was characterized by massive migration all around the Mediterranean and Near East, with only Assyria and Egypt escaping relatively intact. The Iron Age would rise out of the ashes of the Bronze Age cultures, with new people like the Celts of Western Europe, the Phoenicians of Western North Africa, the Greeks of northeastern Europe, and the Persians of South-Central Asia, all emerging as new and vibrant cultures, and eventually full-blown civilizations. We can visualize these periods using a tool known as a timeline, which allows us to break up these periods into successive groups. Now, the further back we go in history, the dates become greater approximations, but these timelines allow us to get our heads wrapped around the depth of human history and the successive periods of development. For example, the later Stone Age, which lasted more than 40,000 years, was characterized by late migrations of modern humans out of Africa, as well as the rise of what some anthropologists call cultural modernity, marked by evidence of symbolic representation necessary for full human consciousness as we understand it today. The Stone Age ends with the Neolithic period, or the New Stone Tool period of human development. Now, the Neolithic period is important to our story, as it's the period in which humans began the widespread process of domestication of both animals and grasses that would give rise to the agricultural revolution, which would mark the first major change in human existence in hundreds of thousands of years. No longer dependent on hunting and gathering, humans began the long march toward the development of civilization, characterized by the division of labor, social hierarchy, economic inequality, and the creation of written language and mathematics. Using the timeline, we can more clearly see how the much shorter Bronze Age is, by comparison, to the earlier Neolithic period. Though it lasted more than 2,000 years, it pales in comparison to the Stone Age. As noted earlier, the end of the Bronze Age is marked by a massive systems collapse, which caused widespread chaos around the Mediterranean and Near East. But Iron Age cultures, like the Greeks, would emerge out of that Bronze Age disruption. Perhaps the people that we know as the Greeks were the few surviving descendants of the Bronze Age Mycenaean civilization, Or perhaps they're an ethnically distinct group who migrated from some other part of the world, or perhaps they're a mixture of the two. We really don't know for sure. But what we do know is that this new Iron Age culture would arise out of the Dark Age to eventually form one of the most influential, if short-lived, civilizations in all of world history. It would be the Greeks that would lay the foundation of Western civilization, and so we begin our timeline of Western intellectual history with Greek civilization. We'll call this the Ancient Period, though, as we've seen, it's really quite recent compared to the whole of human history. Somewhere between 800 and 750 BCE, the Greeks borrowed the alphabetic system developed by the Phoenician civilization and began writing their most important mythic stories. We can thus mark the beginning of the ancient period with Homer, the blind poet traditionally associated with the authorship of the Iliad. Of course, we don't know if there really was such a person, but the literature certainly does exist. Similarly, we can mark the end of the ancient period of Western intellectual history with the philosopher Aristotle, the student of Plato. What's so remarkable is that this brief 400-year period would see the birth, rise, and fall of the civilization that would set the course for the rest of Western civilization. Of particular interest to our story is that this is the period in which the philosophical revolution would occur, marking the beginning of the shift in human consciousness from a mythological to a rational worldview. But we'll talk more about that in our next video. Now, Greek culture would be appropriated by their northern neighbors, the Macedonians, who would embark on a program of cultural imperialism, spreading the culture they had adopted for themselves from Eastern Europe as far east as India. This, of course, is all due to Alexander the Great's expansion of the Macedonian Empire across the ancient Near East. Having conquered the Persian Empire, the superpower of the day, the descendants of Alexander's generals would force Greek culture on the far-flung peoples these Macedonians had conquered. Since Alexander died at the young age of 33 without producing a legitimate heir to the Macedonian throne, his empire was divided amongst his generals, who would establish their own dynasties in the territories they had conquered. Their descendants would oversee a process of Hellenization, or making people like the Greeks. After all, they had adopted Greek culture. Why shouldn't everyone else? Now, this process would result in a massive cross-pollination of ideas throughout the Near East and create a new cultural hegemony known as the Hellenistic World. We should note, however, that this new worldview is Greek-like, not purely Greek. This is why we call it Hellenistic, like the Greek culture. Now, the Macedonian kingdoms would eventually fall into decline through intramural political strife and would finally be eclipsed by the expansion of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BCE. Founded in the late 6th century, the Roman Republic would expand from the Tiber River Valley to encompass the entire Italian peninsula. By the 3rd century BCE, the Republic expanded its influence into North Africa, defeating the Phoenician city-state of Carthage in the Punic Wars, giving Rome dominance of the entire western Mediterranean basin. It was therefore inevitable that the expansionist Romans would eventually come into conflict with the Macedonians to the east. The last of the Macedonian kingdoms to fall to Rome was Egypt, ruled by Cleopatra Philopator Ptolemy, the descendant of Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great. In the final civil war of the Roman Republic, a struggle between the adopted son of Julius Caesar, Octavian, and Julius's general, Mark Antony, the latter would ally himself with the wealthy ruler of Egypt in an attempt to force Octavian to capitulate to his fellow consul. But at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, it was Octavian's forces that defeated Antony and Cleopatra, marking the end of the Hellenistic age. The young Octavian Caesar, now the sole consul of Rome, would consolidate his power, and by 27 BCE be granted the titles Augustus and Imperator, becoming the first emperor of Rome, marking an end of the Republic and the beginning of what we know as the Roman Empire. The next 200 years of the empire, often called the Pax Romana, or Peace of Rome, was marked by economic and political stability throughout the vast territories controlled by the still expanding Roman Empire. For our story, we can think of this period as the Roman harvest of the now ripe Hellenistic world to the east, blending together the cultures and traditions now part of the massive new Roman Empire. One new development of this cultural blending was the rise of new religions, known as mystery religions. These new cults offered a sense of personal worth and identity to people often separated, willfully or otherwise, from their traditional cultural identity. We have to remember that the majority of people who lived in the Roman Empire, women and slaves, didn't directly benefit from the uniformity of Roman law. This massive, disenfranchised population had little chance of social advancement or dignity in the patriarchal Roman world. But these new mystery cults offered the chattel of Roman society the hope of a better future, even if it was in the afterlife. Over the next 300 years, these mystery cults would come to eclipse the more traditional polytheistic cults of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. And of course, by 387 of the Common Era, Christianity, one of these new mystery cults, would become the state religion of the empire itself. Economic disparities between the agrarian western half of the empire and the resource-rich east would cause increasing tensions for later emperors. And its sheer geographical size made management of the empire nearly impossible. This would lead to experimentation with co-rulership, which inevitably disintegrated into civil war. By 476, Romulus Augustus, the last ruler of the western half of the empire, would abdicate his throne, and the western half of the Roman world, already divided by decades of Germanic migration, would eventually collapse. The next period of Western intellectual history has come to be known as the medieval period. While the eastern half of the Roman Empire would continue, the urban civil society of the western half of the empire disintegrated. The only significant remnant of the imperial civil service to survive was the church. Latin, or Roman Christianity, would struggle to hold on to the glory that had been the Western Roman Empire. But without the larger infrastructure of the imperial state, even the church would significantly decline, and the non-Christian religions of the Germanic Goths, Vandals, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, just to name a few, would displace the Roman religion throughout much of Western Europe. But over the succeeding centuries, the Germanic peoples would settle down and intermarry with the descendants of the Romans and begin to form new political and economic entities. A wave of Christian evangelism from Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire, began the process of reintroducing Christianity into Western Europe, and over time, the Roman Church was revitalized. But literacy, so common to the imperial age of Europe, was mostly lost. The old knowledge of the Greco-Roman world had largely disappeared in the West, and only scraps of the past remained. What little intellectual activity that survived in the Middle Ages was focused primarily on spirituality and theology. From the perspective of intellectual history, the medieval period was a long, slow decline, occasionally punctuated by Germanic tribes like the Carolingians who tried to reboot the Roman Empire, only to succumb to new waves of barbarians sweeping across Western Europe. The last of the great barbarian migrations were the Norse, who migrated south in the 9th century of the Common Era. Their descendants would eventually become the foundation of the Norman Empire of the late Middle Ages, and it was their expansion of trade and the religious wars known as the Crusades that would eventually set the stage for the intellectual recovery of Western Europe. But in 1346, the Norman Empire, along with the rest of Western Europe, would be crushed under the pandemic of Yersinia pestis, which caused the Black Death, or bubonic plague, which in just a few years would cause the death of 1/3 of the entire population of Western Europe. Those who survived the great pandemic of plague would find themselves living in an altogether changed world. The decrease in population caused the economic system known as feudalism to collapse, and the peasant population, which had been tied into generations of poverty, suddenly found new economic opportunities. Those with a skilled trade suddenly found themselves in very high demand, and even unskilled peasant farmers could now demand wages from their former landowners. The massive redistribution of wealth among the survivors of the medieval collapse caused a rise in the standard of living across Europe, and the succeeding generations would witness a rise of literacy not seen since the Roman period. From this would rise the Renaissance, or rebirth, of the Greco-Roman intellectual world. The Crusades of the late Middle Ages had seen the return of literature long lost in Western Europe, and this newly literate population of Europe in the Renaissance was hungry for something to read. As these new, or rather old, ideas began to permeate European society, they would kick off a series of intellectual revolutions which would almost completely reject the medieval worldview. But the collapse of medievalism would also inaugurate a wave of skepticism, as the old systems of intellectual authority, rooted in the church and in the state, would be challenged. Adding fuel to the fire, the discovery of movable type would make it possible for almost anyone to publish their thoughts on almost any subject, which created a crisis of intellectual authority. If potentially anyone could publish and distribute their thoughts, how could we tell the difference between good and bad ideas? How were people to know who to listen to? Since almost everything we thought we knew from the medieval world was being challenged, perhaps it was impossible to have any knowledge at all. The crisis of knowledge born of the Renaissance would be addressed by thinkers of the early modern period, or Enlightenment. Philosophers like René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke would struggle to create new paradigms of thought out of the chaos that was the Renaissance. The scientific, religious, and geographical revolutions of the previous age would need to be sorted, collated, and organized into a new picture of the universe. The intellectuals of the modern period would tackle this problem head-on, giving rise to a mechanistic model of the universe and everything in it. The modern period would see the triumph of the new science, born of astronomy, but quickly expanding into the rise of physics, chemistry, and by the 19th century, modern biology. But the rise of modern science would have been impossible without the intellectual framework of empiricism articulated by John Locke. It was the empirical model of epistemology that explained why experimentalism, or the scientific method as we know it, worked. But empiricism and the mechanistic model of the modern period would become so successful that it would eventually cause a cultural backlash that longed for something more ineffable. The latter half of the modern era, or the Romantic period of the 19th century, would challenge the belief in inevitable progress, seemingly guaranteed by empirically driven investigations. The modern period would thus come to an end with thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who challenged what he called the bourgeois modern Western intellectual hegemony of Christianity, science, and nationalism. That brings us to our period, That brings us to our own period, which, for lack of a better term, we currently call the postmodern era. Of course, it's hard to see the forest for the trees, and what our place in the intellectual history of the West will ultimately look like is for future intellectual historians to decide. Even the term postmodern will likely be replaced with something more apt by those future scholars. But what's essential to understand as we begin a study of Western philosophy is that we are part of an ongoing conversation that began with the ancient Greeks more than 2,500 years ago. Having a cursory understanding of the various periods of Western intellectual history will provide us a framework in which we can better understand thinkers like Socrates and Plato, Saints Anselm and Thomas, Descartes and Locke. While useful for providing some context to our investigations, we must also remind ourselves that this is the barest of outlines, and the more one delves into these periods of intellectual history, the more complex and detailed the story becomes. But we have to start somewhere. To summarize what we've covered in this video, the Western intellectual tradition begins in what we call the Ancient Period. This encompasses the birth, rise, and fall of the Greek intellectual tradition, which marks, as we'll see in more detail in the next video, the beginning of the shift from a mythological worldview toward a rational one. The Hellenistic period marks the spread of Greek ideas throughout the Near East, thanks to the cultural imperialism of the Macedonians, who were so enthralled with the Greek culture that they had appropriated. They wanted to make sure everyone adopted it as well. The Romans would come to eclipse the Hellenistic world and take those cross-pollinated cultures and throw them into the stew that would become the Roman world. More eclectic than creative, the Romans would create a new political and economic hegemony that would give rise to an entirely novel understanding of religion in the form of the mystery cults that would forever transform the landscape, for good or ill, of our religious awareness. The collapse of the Roman period is followed by the medieval period, in which intellectual activity in the West was almost completely restricted to the interests of spirituality and religion. To be sure, there were some modest discoveries here and there, but we can really grasp the general sense of things in the Middle Ages by saying that everything that they knew was old. But the Renaissance would see the rediscovery of even older ways of thinking, the revival or rebirth of humanism, which had its origins in the pre-Christian Mediterranean world. This would spark a series of intellectual revolutions that would cause the rise of skepticism, which forced Enlightenment thinkers to take a fresh look at our epistemological assumptions and would eventually lead to the model of knowledge that we take for granted today. In our next video, we're going to go back to the beginning and revisit the ancient period of Western intellectual history in more detail to explore the philosophical revolution that would set this whole chain of Western intellectual history in motion. See you next time.